Welcome to Literary Libations with Librarians. And this time we are talking about book clubs and reading groups because October is National Reading Group Month. So we're going to share some of our favorite titles that we read because we were a part of a book club or a reading group. As we're sharing these titles, if you'd like to get your hands on any of them, the quickest way to do that is probably to call your local branch of the Monroe County Library System and speak to a staff member there, and they'll be more than happy to assist you. If you want to request your own through our online catalog, that address is on your screen now, and that'll give you access to physical versions, hardcovers, paperbacks, etc. Some of the titles we talk about will be available digitally through one of our two platforms. The first is Overdrive, and the app for Overdrive is Libby, and you may hear those two terms used interchangeably. But Overdrive provides downloadable ebooks and audiobooks, and also magazines. The other platform is Hoopla, and Hoopla provides downloadable audiobooks and ebooks, and also movies, music, and graphic novels. And one of the great things about Hoopla is if you look for the lightning bolt on a title, that means you can download it immediately. There's never a waiting list with those lightning bolt titles on Hoopla. And you can also do a filtered search, which I found useful, and you can ask for instant borrows, and that will give you the same thing as the lightning bolt. So if you want to get rid of all the other ones that you can't get right away, you can do an instant filter for your search. I am Jennifer Graneski. I'm the community librarian at the Dundee Branch Library. And since we're talking about book club titles this week, our question for this week is, what do you enjoy about being a part of a book club or a reading group? So I have been a part of and been the facilitator for the Dundee Book Club since I started here. So it's been like 15 years now, which is kind of crazy. And when I first started, I was always super nervous before a book club, because I wasn't sure what we were supposed to talk about or what people did at a book club. And I discovered that my book club just likes to talk about the book and pretty much anything else that's going on in the community. We enjoy talking about movies and local restaurants and major issues that are happening in, our country. So we cover everything at our book club. And I think one of my favorite things is just the people who attend and the different point of views, and the ability for us to talk about different topics and do so thoughtfully and civilly and have a really good discussion about whatever's in that book that we want to talk about. So we have a pretty unstructured group. We go in and just, so what stood out to you in the book? And we just start talking. So that's one of my favorite things. And I also have to mention, I think this is true for anybody that's part of a book club or reading group, but the fact that it makes me read things that I wouldn't otherwise ever pick up. Normally when I read for my own personal pleasure and happiness, and usually I'm picking up a horror novel or a thriller. So being a part of a book club makes me read things, and I've learned so much reading those titles. So those are some things I enjoy about being part of a book club. Also with us this week is Kristen Brown, a reference librarian at the Bedford branch. And what do you enjoy about book club, Kristen?
I feel like you pretty much hit all of the aspects with that, because I would have to agree. It's the really great conversations that you have with everybody. My book club that I facilitate is the same way. It's just kind of very low key, and we start off talking about the book and how we felt about it, and then gradually the conversation ends up going on tangents, which is always really nice because we can always relate it back to the book somehow. But sometimes we just start having these really broad conversations, which is absolutely great. So my main reason though is just reading titles that I would normally not have picked up. And on the social media that I have, I usually am the one that's like, join a book club. This is the book we read this month, and it was amazing. And I didn't really want to read it at first, but it turned out so great. So highly recommend book clubs.
Excellent. Thank you, Kristen. Also with us this week is Jody Russ, the community librarian at the Bedford branch. And what do you enjoy about being part of a book club, Jody?
Many of the same things you guys already discussed. The book club that I host is called Just the Facts. So we read all nonfiction titles. And I guess for me, it creates the necessity for me, I should say, to read about things that I am interested in, that I maybe wouldn't make the time to pick up that book and read that thing if not for the book club. But also, I find it's a very interesting dynamic that I have. The people in my book club are almost all my mom's age. And so just the different perceptions, although now, interestingly enough, I have 2 people who have joined who are my oldest child's age. So I now have, 3 generations of people in this, a couple of retired librarians, a couple of retired teachers. So like, again, very thoughtful and respectful conversations about things that we might have very diverse viewpoints on. And if not for that book club, there's a whole lot of topics that I would have never made the time to read the books about. So I find it very interesting. And we always just read we read about a subject, different titles on that subject. So it is, I don't know, I think that maybe creates a little more interest because you get different perspectives about the subject because everybody's read a different title. So
that's interesting. I like that. Thank you, Jody. Also with us this week is Kelly Beister, the branch technician at the South Rockwood branch. And what do you enjoy about being a part of a book club, Kelly?
All the answers that you just said, for sure. But my most favorite book club is, I started at South Rockwood, is young adult for grown-ups, because young adult books are usually, just for the teenagers. But there's a group of us that just like to read young adult books because I find adult fiction extremely boring and repetitive. So so I like that. But I also
now all of adult fiction is super sad, Kelly.
I know.
They're all sad. Kelly doesn't like them.
I know, but like, yeah, young adult books, I feel like there's so much, and there's such a wide variety, and I love that the group that I have, we all connect on that, and the tangents especially are my favorite, like Kristen said. Sometimes we go back to what we were discussing. Sometimes we just get stuck talking about 90 Day Fiance and Married at First Sight. I mean, when you have someone who loves young adult and trashy TV, like, that's a friendship, right? And we even got a couple other members who are actually watching these shows, so now they can be involved in our side conversations, which is always fun. But yeah, I like all of it. It makes me sit down and read books because being a busy person, it's hard for me to actually sit down and read with a book, which I love. But I also do a historical fiction book, and I've really enjoyed that as well. Book club book, so.
Nice. Thanks, Kelly. And we're going to go ahead and get started sharing some of the titles that we enjoyed and read because we were part of book clubs. And let's go ahead and have Kristen kick us off.
Okay. So I will start with, I think The Dutch House is the first one. And so I'm actually going to read what the little blurb is, because trying to talk about this book in my own way, I feel like I would go off on these tangents and it would be kind of hard to keep it up to date. So at the end of the Second World War, Cyril Conroy combines luck and a single candy investment to begin an enormous real estate empire, propelling his family from poverty to enormous wealth. So his first order of business is to buy the Dutch House, which is this lavish estate in the suburbs outside of Philadelphia. He buys this house as a surprise for his wife, but the house sets in motion the undoing of everyone he loves. Dun, dun, dun. So it's set over the course of 5 decades. And it says the Dutch House is a dark fairy tale about 2 smart people who cannot overcome their past. Despite every outward sign of success, Danny and Mauve are only truly comfortable when they're together. And that's the brother and sister that are the main characters in this story, or a pair of them. Throughout their lives, they return to the well-worn story of what they've lost with humor and rage. And when at last they are forced to confront the people who left them behind, the relationship between an indulged brother and his ever-positive sister is finally tested. Just really great writing. This book, originally when we put it on the list, it was suggested by one of the members, and I thought, okay, yeah, we'll try something new. And once I started reading it, it was really hard for me to put it down. What I really enjoyed was the relationship between the brother and the sister. It reminded me of the sibling relationship that Alice Hoffman puts in her Rules of Magic. So just great writing. It was a really, really great book. And for my second choice, I chose The Fate of Mercy Albin. Oh, and The Dutch House is by Anne Patchett.
I always say Patchett, but I have no idea.
Patchett.
I just go with this straightforward.
The Fate of Mercy Albin is by Wendy Webb. And so this book is about long buried family secrets, a packet of old love letters, and a lost manuscript that plunge Grace, who is the main character, her and her daughter are the main characters, into a decade-old mystery about a scandalous party at the Albin house when a world-famous author took his own life and Grace's aunt disappeared without a trace. The night has been shrouded in secrecy by the powerful Albin family for all of these years, and Grace realizes that her family secrets tangle and twist as darkly as the secret passages of the Albin house. So it's a mystery. It's got a little bit of horror in it. It's a thriller. And so there's a little tiny bit, like there's a love kind of thing that goes on there too, but basically Grace must uncover the truth about her home and its curse before her and her daughter become the next victims. So I normally don't really read thrillers, and I wasn't really expecting this book to be that good, but one of our goals in our book club is to read a book that's based in Michigan, and so this was kind of like our Michigan title, but I loved this book. There's some creepy parts in there where I was reading it and I had to kind of like put it down for a minute because it creeped me out a little bit. And there's a really unexpected twist at the end that my book club was not especially fond of. I thought it was really great. It was really like, what? We were all kind of scratching our heads. But it was really good. I thought it was a good book. It's not super long, so I recommend picking up those ones.
Nice. That sounds like it would be right up my alley, Kristen.
It does, yeah. Except for the ending. I feel like if you do read this, please message me when you finish it so I can see what you got. Because we got the book.
I join with the book club going, what?
So, yeah. Okay.
All right. Thank you, Kristen. And the Dutch House, I've heard a lot about, but I have not read that one. But I know there was a moment in time back when, pre-pandemic, when a lot of people were talking about it. And I kind of want to say, and I could be wrong on this, so, feel free to let me know, but I feel like the audiobook was maybe read by Tom Hanks. Anybody know? I feel like that was true. But I don't know if that's not the case.
I feel like I need to check that out and see if Tom Hanks narrating it changes my point of view at all.
Yeah. There you go. All right. So let's have Kelly share her books that she enjoyed and read because of book club.
So mine are both young adults because that's my jam. And the first one we'll talk about is The Project. And we just read this one last month for our book club pick because we were hoping to get a little bit spooky. Also, I'm obsessed with cults. Anything with cults I find very, very fascinating, and this one is about a cult. So this story, The Project by Courtney Summers, it's a standalone. The main characters are B and Lo. B is the older sister. The book starts with her sister being born. She's really upset about it. Her parents let her pick her name. She names her Gloria, and they call her Lo. 11 years later, Lo and her parents get in a car accident. Her parents pass away, and Lo is on life support and on the verge of passing herself. B, being not a religious person, she finds herself in a chapel and she's praying to whoever will listen to help her sister. That's when she meets a leader of a religious cult. His name is Lev. The book is a little bit confusing at the beginning because they kind of go back and forth between when Lo was in the hospital to now. So 6 years later, Lo is 17 or 18, and she's living on her own. She has no contact with B, and her parents are passed, and she's working as a journalist assistant for a big magazine because she wants to be a writer. It goes back and forth about how B gets involved in the cult and how Lo has been reaching her or trying to reach her to create a relationship with her. What I loved about this book, I don't want to give too much away to ruin the story, but what I love about this book, it pulls you into the cult to make you think like, well, everyone thinks it's a bad thing, but really it's not. As you're reading, you're like, well, what's so bad about that? It's not, I mean, he's a good guy and he's doing what he thinks is right. And then all of a sudden you are smacked with reality, and Lo is even taken into that, where she's so against it. She's trying to investigate it and find all these faults. And then all of a sudden she's pulled in by the magic of love and falls in love with him. And then you're just like, wait, what? Like, it was so crazy reading it, where you're like, okay, I get it. Like, you look at this beautiful human being who has all the answers and wants to help, or looks like he wants to help. And you are just immediately sucked in, and you don't realize what is really going on until you start hearing testaments and people's reactions to it and the people who have lived through it. So the book was like mind blowing. I couldn't put it down. And then, like I said, like for me to get pulled in and be like, well, what's wrong with this cult? I was like, oh God, I need to stop like researching cults, or else I'm going to be in one, because I'm so gullible apparently that I'm going to be like in a cult now. Like, it kind of freaked me out that I would like, usually I can see through, especially in books, right? You can usually guess what's going to happen and you can see through things. I couldn't see through this at all. Like, it was crazy until the end. So that was, I love this book. It, like I said, it's a little bit tricky to get into because it goes back and forth, and it takes some going back to see like, wait, where am I and what is going on? But once you figure out the outline of it, it kind of goes where it needs to go and picks up real fast. So The Project by Courtney Summers, I would definitely recommend that if you're into weird cults and spooky stuff. The second book,
I mean, come on.
I mean, honestly. It just boggles my mind. Like, how can you be sucked in? That was my stance on it, and now I don't know. I got sucked in, so I guess I better keep my distance from them. The second book that I really loved, excuse me, reread last year in our book club, and it's called The Vanishing Deep by Astrid Schulte. This is more of like a science fiction-y dystopian book, and not really dystopia, more like futuristic, I guess. I'm not usually into sci-fi. It's not my gig at all. Like, I like, murder and happy things. So this was not like, I know that's like two totally different things, but sci-fi is like not my thing at all. But this one has really, really stuck with me. So the main character's Temp, or Tempest is her name. They call her Temp. She's 17 years old. She lost her parents, and then about a year or two later lost her sister, her older sister. They live in a world that has been overcome with the great waves. So everything is flooded. There's certain reefs that they live on. They call the equinox. It's kind of a weird thing. They watch everyone that lives who comes and goes, because if there's too many people, the reef will sink and then they're all gone. There's one main island called Paladramina. I have such a hard time with this. Paladramina, and that's like where they take all the dead and they keep the dead. Because here's the thing, when you have a loved one that dies, if you have the right amount of money, you can pay to have your loved one brought back for 24 hours to say your final goodbyes. So Temp has no idea what's happened to her sister. She has no idea what happens to her parents, what really happened. So she is determined to get money so that she can bring her sister back to ask questions. Because everything is flooded, everything from the old world is underneath water, and there are a lot of people who dive to find like old world remnants to sell for antiques. And Temp ends up finding a lucrative treasure that brings in enough money for her sister's revival. But she's not there to ask or to say her final goodbye. She wants answers. When she's doing all this, there's a side story of the employees of the Paladramina island, and one of the employees who lives in the basement is in charge of that area and the mechanical things down there. He ends up taking a place for a friend who needs to go to a doctor's appointment to find out if he'll ever be able to dive, because that's his true love. So he's like, just sit with this girl. It's no big deal. It's run of the mill. Well, it's not, because Temp wants to break out her sister, Elsie, and on that journey, they pull in Lore, who is the hermited employee in the basement. And as they are ticking down the hours of the 24 hours together, she figures out answers for her parents, her sister, and then also answers to what's going on really on the island. So there was a lot of stuff. This too was another book where it was like, you were, oh yeah, I see what's going to happen. I see what's going to happen. Then all of a sudden it shifted and you were like, wait, what? And like had to go back to make sure that you were reading the right thing. So if you're not one for sci-fi, but you want to maybe put your toes into the water, this would be a really good one, because it was really good. And like I said, it's really stuck with me since last February. So.
Wow. Thank you, Kelly. And let's have Jody share her book club titles.
Okay, so the first title that I will share is called Silver Like Dust by Kimmy Cunningham Grant. Remember, we do nonfiction, so this is a nonfiction that reads like a fiction. It pairs nicely with titles like Hotel on the Corner of Bitter and Sweet or Love and Other Consolation Prizes by Jamie Ford. And I think that's the reason why we had this topic. The topic was Japanese internment camps. So when Hotel on the Corner of Bitter and Sweet was the Michigan Reader One Book, One Community Read, this was the topic that we read about. So this is the story of one family's experience in the Japanese internment camps in America during and after World War II. Kimmy's Oba-chan, or grandmother, was a survivor of one of those camps, having lived in one with family members for more than 5 years during her youth. Oba-chan would never speak of it, but as her granddaughter, when Kimmy was an adult and she purposely spent time with her grandmother, she started to earn her trust, and her grandmother began to open up and tell her story of Heart Mountain, which is now a National Historic Landmark in Wyoming, and it was the place where she lost her mother and found her husband. So Oba-chan had two brothers who served in the American military during World War II, fighting against Japan, and that only served to cause more mixed emotions about why the government felt the need to lock up 112,000 Japanese Americans in the camps. And then they weren't freed. They weren't freed until a year after the war ended, and it was all very confusing and a lot of misunderstandings. And from Amazon's description of the book, I thought this was good. From the turmoil, racism, and paranoia that sprang up after the bombing of Pearl Harbor and the terrifying train ride to Heart Mountain to the false promise of VJ Day, Silver Like Dust captures a vital chapter of the Japanese American experience through the journey of one remarkable woman. Her story is one of thousands, yet is a powerful testament to the enduring bonds of family and an unusual look at the American dream. And then Booklist also said, I thought this one was also good. Grant offers a portrait of the stoicism and patriotism of her family, as well as differences in generations, as the stories evoke her own feelings of rage. But throughout is a portrait of a courageous woman who endured hardship and later established a delicate balance of trust with her granddaughter that allowed her to finally tell her family's stories. One of the things that really struck all of us, I know, when we were discussing these things, is that the Japanese Americans who were in these camps never talked about it. Like, that was the thing with Kimmy and her grandmother. They didn't talk about it. It was shameful for them, which is, unfortunate, because clearly it shouldn't have been shame on them. It should have been shame on the people who made that happen to them. But that's how many of them felt and why many of them never spoke up about it. And it took new generations of their family members to really bring everything to light that happened in that time period. So that was a very interesting one that we read. And then the second title that I chose is called The Wisdom of Wolves by Jim and Jamie Dutcher. And I think I picked this one because this is the topic that we just read and discussed last week. We read for September and discussed at the end of the month. And that was Wolves, which we originally were supposed to discuss in 2020, and then, you know, we didn't have any book clubs. So I think everyone in the book club was surprised at how much they enjoyed this topic. I don't know that they expected to find it as interesting as we all did. So we read a variety of titles, as I mentioned earlier, on the topic, some which focused on specific packs like those in Denali and those in Yellowstone. But I actually listened to this book, and its subtitle is Lessons from the Sawtooth Pack. So for 6 years, Jim and Jamie Dutcher lived intimately with a pack of wolves, and this book shares what they observed in wolf society and behavior, and is a thought-provoking work on the values shared between the human and the animal world. There's several titles for both adults and kids by the Dutchers that talk about their time with the wolves, including a beautiful photo journal published by National Geographic. So the Sawtooth Pack was created by the Dutchers for their research. They found a piece of government-owned land, and they created a very large enclosure, and then they recruited pups from different packs who needed to be cared for, mostly because their adults had been killed. And so they brought these pups to this enclosure and got them acclimated to humans because they wanted them. They needed to do that so that the pups would survive, so that they could take care of them. But then they tried to create as natural a surrounding as they possibly could for these wolves to grow up in, so that they could see what their life was like. So there's two different documentaries that came from this. They were called Wolves at Our Door and Living with Wolves. They were both on the Discovery Channel, but all of the titles that the book club members read shared some very similar observations about wolf behavior, about how each wolf plays a distinct role in the pack, and that if a single wolf either leaves the pack, which doesn't happen very often, or is killed, the knowledge that they have is just gone. And so we learned some really interesting things. It's a very interesting animal interaction, the way that they interact with each other. So like I said, I think everybody was surprised at how much they enjoyed reading about something that can be very controversial, because ranchers say that, you know, wolves attack their animals, and there's absolutely nothing factual that points to that. So it's kind of a interesting dynamic.
Interesting. Thank you, Jody. The wolf thing is interesting to me because I know that that was discussed a lot in the UP, and my husband has family in the UP, and there were some wolf issues up there and discussion about whether or not to allow hunting or not. So interesting. Thank you.
You're welcome.
And my two titles, one of the things that always surprises me is that the titles that tend to really stick with me are often nonfiction, even though I am not somebody who naturally picks up nonfiction to read. So one of those titles is The Radium Girls by Kate Moore. And I was actually surprised that neither I nor anybody else had talked about this book yet for Literary Libations, because it is fascinating and is, again, one of those parts of history that you move through your history classes so quickly, you don't get to really delve into the deeper stories of what is happening to people. You just look at wide swaths of history at a time. So the Radium Girls takes place during the First World War. And just prior to that, you know, the Curies have made their discovery about radium, and it seems like radium is this amazing cure-all for everything. And part of what was interesting is radium's being put into face lotions. It's being put into food. It's, you know, and they think that as long as it's in small enough quantities, this is all good for you. And she shares some advertisements that were out there during this time. And one of the things that radium does is that it glows in the dark. And so one of the things that they need for the war effort are watches and dials and planes that will glow in the dark so that they can do night missions easily. And so a couple of factories say, we can set this up. We're going to start doing this. They hire women to come in and do these jobs. They're well-paying jobs. They have some prestige to them as women get these jobs and talk to other women about the money that they're making. And as you're reading this, and now what radium can do to people, in particular, there's a scene where they talk about they have to get the numbers on the dials and the watches really fine. And so they talk about the women taking their brushes, dipping them in the mixture of the radium, and then putting them in their mouth so that they can get that nice, sharp, fine point. And you're reading this and you're just cringing because you know what's coming. And of course, as time goes on, the women begin to fall ill and their lives are devastated. And the physical descriptions of what happens to them as a result of working in these factories are horrifying. But what's even maybe more horrifying is as they begin to realize what the radium is doing to the women, the business has very little interest in stopping this production or in creating protections of some sort, or even in really issuing something that says, hey, don't put this in your mouth. It's going to give you oral cancer and create all sorts of problems. And part of the thing that the author points out is the business knew before the women did that what problems radium could cause. And they didn't do anything. And then when the women start coming to them and saying, this is what's happening, and I believe this is the cause of it, they ignore them, they deny it, they continue to do these things. And it's just shocking how these women were treated and how hard they and their families had to fight for any sort of compensation and any sort of future protection for women who may be asked to do these jobs. So it led to a really interesting discussion about business and what do they owe to their workers and what do they owe to their consumers. And a discussion of capitalism and how it can lead to amazing and creative innovations, but it can also be destructive in a lot of lives. So it is a really interesting book. I listened to it. It is a great listen. And then I was told, well, you need to pick up the actual book, and there are pictures in there, and those are heartbreaking and devastating. So I think, it's one of those points of history where you're like, wow, didn't know about that. And are we doing better now because we know about that? So the Radium Girls, really interesting part of history. Kate Moore just came out with another nonfiction book, which I want to pick up, and I can't think of what it is right now. The Woman Who Talked. It's about a woman who ends up in an asylum. And again, nonfiction. So Kate Moore, good author.
Another note about that one that I feel like Kate Moore, because we read that one in my book club too, but she did a really good job painting the personal stories of each woman that she covered like
a lot. So it was like two different factories and two different areas.
But she set everything up. Like she told you about their families and what was on the line and how, like when they got the jobs, how excited they were. And then as things started to progress, like many of them couldn't have children anymore. And just like their bottom jaws would be gone. It was, I am very surprised that we haven't talked about that book yet. When you said that, I was like, oh, geez, we haven't. But it's very, very heartbreaking, but also it needs to be read. Absolutely.
So, and my other title is Elizabeth is Missing. And this one is a mystery that is more than a mystery. It's told from the point of view of Maud, who is an octogenarian and whose mind is slowly devolving. She's struggling with dementia and she's confused much of the time, but not all of the time. And unlike most unreliable narrator books, Maud never lies. she's always telling you the truth. But part of your job as the reader is to try and pull out, where is this truth happening in the timeline of her life? Because it turns out that there are two mysteries for Maud. The first is the contemporary one where her closest friend, Elizabeth, is missing. And Maud is convinced that she is missing not because she's moved away or because she's in the hospital, like Elizabeth's son keeps telling her, but she is convinced that something horrible has happened to Elizabeth. And so Maud is trying to get the police to listen to her. She's trying to get her daughter, Helen, who's her caretaker, to listen to her. And of course, Helen knows everything that's been happening with Maud and the things that she forgets and that she doesn't remember. And she keeps trying to tell her, no, Elizabeth is fine. She's just not in her house right now. And Maud is convinced that's not the case. And then the other mystery happened back when Maud was a teenager and her sister disappeared. And nobody ever found out what happened to her sister, Suki. And so both of these mysteries intertwine as you view what is happening through Maud's eyes. And if you're a mystery reader, the mystery part of it soon takes a back seat because you're probably going to have a pretty good guess at what happened. And instead, it's this journey through Maud's life, and it's heartbreaking, and it makes you realize how fragile who we are really is, and how that can be lost, and how important it is to have people who you love and who love you on that journey with you. It's a lovely and devastating book all at once. They did turn it into a movie, and it aired on PBS within the last year or two, and I didn't hate it. The movie, while it had to cut out a lot of what is in the book, and it has to make things a bit less confusing for the person watching it because you're not just getting Maud's point of view, it definitely has an impact. The actor who plays Maud is incredible, and her performance is tragic. My husband and I watched it together, and he had not read the book, and we finished, and he said something to the effect of, I'm glad we watched that, and it was really good, but I don't want to watch it again because it just hurts that much. So excellent book, was an excellent discussion. And I know it's really hard to pick up those books where you're like, well, this book is going to be a hard one. But sometimes those are the books that really make us think about what it means to be who we are and the loved ones that are in our lives. So those are my two books. And thank you to all of you for sharing your titles. And thank you to those of you who've listened. And next time, it's the season for spooky spine chillers and thrillers. So my favorite season. And if nobody else wants to join me next week, I could probably just, share all 12 titles. So that'll be what we'll be talking about next time. Thank you, and we hope you have great weeks. Bye.